The key turned in the lock with a sound that seemed too final, too permanent for Sarah Marrowgate's liking. The brass mechanism clicked with the weight of decades, and the heavy oak door of her grandmother's estate swung open on hinges that groaned like something in pain. Sarah stepped across the threshold into air that tasted of dust, old wood, and something else, something that made her tongue feel thick and her chest tight. The foyer stretched before her, illuminated by shafts of late afternoon sunlight that filtered through tall windows draped in burgundy velvet. Motes of dust danced in the golden beams, but they moved wrong somehow, swirling in patterns that defied the stillness of the air. Sarah set her purse down on an antique table near the door and called out, though she knew no one would answer. "Hello? Anyone here?" Her voice echoed back distorted, as if the house had taken her words and twisted them before returning them to her ears. The sound seemed to bounce off surfaces that shouldn't exist, creating phantom rooms and corridors that her eyes couldn't see. Sarah pulled the envelope from her coat pocket, the one that had brought her here from Boston 3 days after her grandmother Evelyn's funeral. Inside were the keys, a brief letter from the estate lawyer, and a handwritten note that simply read, "The house has been waiting for you. E.M." The handwriting was her grandmother's, but shakier than Sarah remembered, as if written by hands that trembled with more than age. She moved deeper into the house, her footsteps muffled by a Persian rug that might have been beautiful once but now bore stains that looked deliberately placed, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. The living room opened to her left, furnished with chairs and settees that seemed to lean toward each other in conspiratorial angles. Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Marrowgate women staring down with eyes that followed her movement across the room. "Jesus," Sarah whispered, pausing before a particularly unsettling painting of a woman who could have been her twin, dressed in clothing from the 1920s. The nameplate read, "Margaret Marrowgate, 1923. The woman's painted eyes held an expression Sarah had seen in her own mirror during her darkest moments, a kind of resigned terror, as if she were watching something approach that she could neither stop nor escape. A sound from somewhere deeper in the house made Sarah turn. It was soft, rhythmic, like someone walking in slippered feet across hardwood floors. But when she held her breath and listened, the sound stopped, leaving only the settling groans of old timber and the whisper of wind through unseen gaps. Sarah climbed the main staircase, her hand trailing along a banister worn smooth by generations of Marrowgate palms. The second-floor hallway stretched in both directions, lined with doors that stood slightly ajar, as if someone had been checking each room just moments before her arrival. She pushed open the first door and found her grandmother's bedroom, exactly as she remembered it from childhood visits, the four-poster bed with its heavy curtains, the vanity table crowded with silver-backed brushes and bottles of perfume that had long since gone rancid. But there was something new. On the nightstand beside the bed sat a leather-bound journal, thick with years of entries. Sarah approached it carefully, as if it might bite. The cover was worn to softness, and when she opened it, the pages released a smell like incense mixed with something metallic that made her gag. The first entry was dated 40 years ago, written in her grandmother's neat cursive, "The prayers are not working as they should. I can feel it listening, waiting for the words to weaken. Mother never told me about the listening. I pray it will not pass to Sarah." Sarah's hands shook as she turned the pages. The entries grew more frequent, more desperate, the handwriting deteriorating with each passing year. Phrases jumped out at her, "It knows she's coming. The basement door is warm tonight. I dreamed of Margaret again, and she was screaming prayers in that language I don't know. The blood on the altar has dried black, but the thing beneath still hungers. I can hear Sarah's heartbeat even though she's in Boston. It's calling to her. God forgive me, but I think I'm going to answer." Sarah slammed the journal shut and backed away from the nightstand. Her rational mind tried to assert itself. Her grandmother had been 93 when she died, possibly suffering from dementia, writing down the paranoid fantasies of a deteriorating brain. But something in the house pushed back against that explanation, something that made the air itself feel thick with attention. She left the bedroom and continued down the hallway, checking each room with growing unease. A sewing room where half-finished quilts lay draped over chairs like abandoned skin. A library where every book seemed to be a different version of the Bible, each one bristling with bookmarks and annotations. A guest room where the bed was made but the pillow bore the impression of a head, as if someone had been lying there recently, listening to her movements through the house. At the end of the hall, Sarah found a door she didn't remember from her childhood visits. It was smaller than the others, painted white but stained with something that had seeped through the wood in finger-like patterns. When she tried the handle, it wouldn't turn. The door was locked, but there was no keyhole, no visible mechanism that would explain how to open it. She pressed her ear to the wood and immediately jerked back. The door was warm, not just warm, but pulsing with heat that came in regular intervals, like a massive heartbeat. Each pulse was accompanied by a sound so low she felt it more than heard it, a vibration that traveled up through her bones and settled in her chest like a second pulse. Sarah ran back to her grandmother's bedroom and grabbed the journal, flipping through it with desperate fingers until she found what she was looking for. The basement door knows she's coming. I can feel it getting ready. The key is where it's always been, where God can't see it. In the hollow place where faith goes to die. She looked up from the journal and caught her reflection in her grandmother's vanity mirror. For just a moment, her face seemed wrong, older, more worn, with eyes that held the same resigned terror she'd seen in Margaret's portrait. Behind her reflection, something moved in the shadows of the room, something tall and patient that watched her with interest that felt hungry. Sarah spun around, but the room was empty. Only the journal remained, open to a page she hadn't turned to, where fresh ink spelled out words in her grandmother's handwriting, "Welcome home, Sarah. It's time to pray." The basement door pulsed once, twice, and in that rhythm Sarah heard something that might have been her name, whispered in voices that sounded like every Marrowgate woman who had ever lived. She clutched the journal to her chest and backed toward the stairs, but the house itself seemed to lean inward, the walls pressing closer, the shadows reaching for her with fingers made of darkness and desperate prayer. Have you ever inherited something that felt like it was watching you back? Tell us about the strangest thing a family member left behind. Sarah spent the night in her grandmother's bedroom, the journal clutched against her chest like a shield. She hadn't meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had overtaken her sometime after midnight, and she'd awakened to pale morning light filtering through curtains that seemed heavier than they had the day before. The basement door's pulsing had continued through the night, a steady rhythm that had worked its way into her dreams and turned them into something that felt more like memories. She made coffee in the kitchen using supplies she found in cabinets that opened at her touch, as if the house anticipated her needs. The normalcy of the morning routine felt like a lie. Every mundane action, measuring grounds, filling the pot with water, waiting for it to brew, was underscored by the weight of watching eyes and the persistent sense that she was not alone in the house. With her coffee in hand, Sarah returned to the library she'd briefly explored the night before. In daylight, the room's true scope became apparent. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, filled with what must have been hundreds of religious texts. Bibles in different translations, prayer books from various denominations, theological treatises, and books of saints' lives created a sanctuary of faith that should have felt comforting. Instead, the room radiated a kind of desperate energy, as if someone had been searching through these pages for answers that refused to be found. Sarah pulled a leather-bound Bible from the shelf at random and opened it to Genesis. The pages were covered in annotations written in different hands and different inks, some so old the writing had faded to brown shadows. But what made her breath catch were the symbols carved directly into the paper, strange geometric patterns that seemed to writhe when she looked at them directly. They weren't drawn or written, they were cut into the pages with something sharp, the paper raised and torn around the edges of each mark. She reached for another book, then another. Every single religious text bore the same treatment. Crosses had been carved into psalms, twisted spirals cut through the Gospels, and symbols that hurt to look at were pressed into the margins like brands. The defacement wasn't random vandalism, it was systematic, deliberate, as if someone had been trying to rewrite Scripture itself through violence done to the page. In a small prayer book dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Sarah found a loose sheet of paper tucked between pages that had been carved so extensively they were more whole than text. The paper was covered in her grandmother's handwriting, but the words made no sense, the symbols help it listen. The cuts in the holy words make doorways. Pastor Morrison doesn't understand, the prayers work better when they bleed. Sarah set the book down with shaking hands and backed away from the shelves. The carved symbols seemed to pulse with their own light now, creating patterns that connected across different books, different pages, as if the entire library had been turned into a single, massive sigil designed for a purpose she couldn't fathom. She needed answers, and she knew where to find them. The drive to St. Mary's Catholic Church took 20 minutes through Vermont countryside that looked innocuous in the morning light. Rolling hills dotted with farmhouses and stone walls that had stood since colonial times gave no hint of the darkness that seemed to permeate her grandmother's estate. Sarah parked in the empty lot and found Pastor Morrison in the sanctuary, arranging flowers on the altar with movements that spoke of long practice. "You must be Sarah," he said without turning around. "I've been expecting you." Pastor Morrison was younger than she'd anticipated, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to carry more weight than his years should have given him. When he looked at her, she saw recognition there, and something that might have been pity. "You knew my grandmother," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "I knew your grandmother, your great-grandmother, and her mother before that. The Marrowgate women have been coming to me for spiritual counsel for as long as I've served this parish, and according to my predecessor's records, long before that." He set down the flowers and gestured for her to sit in a front pew. "What did you find in the house, Sarah?" The question was asked with such gentle certainty that Sarah found herself answering before she'd decided to speak. "Books. Religious books, all of them, damaged. Cut up. And there's a door in the basement that pulses," Pastor Morrison finished. "Yes. Your grandmother told me about the door. She'd been telling me about it for 40 years, along with the dreams, the voices, and the prayers that seemed to make everything worse instead of better." Sarah leaned forward. "What did she tell you, exactly?" Pastor Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his fingers working at the rosary beads around his waist. "She told me that the Marrowgate women carry something with them. A burden that passes from mother to daughter, generation after generation. She said it was drawn to faith, that it fed on prayer and devotion, growing stronger with each attempt to banish it through holy means." "That's impossible," Sarah said, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Is it?" Pastor Morrison turned to face her fully. "You've been in that house for less than 24 hours, and already you can feel it, can't you? The weight of all those desperate prayers, carved into books and bled into pages. Your grandmother wasn't the first Marrowgate woman to come to me with torn Bibles and symbols cut into prayer books. They all tried the same things, more prayer, more devotion, more ritual, and it never worked. If anything, it made the presence stronger." Sarah thought of the basement door, of the way it had pulsed with increasing intensity throughout the night. "What did you tell them to do?" "I told them to stop praying." Pastor Morrison's voice was barely above a whisper. "I told them that sometimes the thing we're fighting is drawn to our very attempts to fight it. But they never listened. The Marrowgate women always believed that if they just prayed harder, believed more completely, sacrificed more of themselves to God, they could break whatever curse or entity had attached itself to their family line. And you think that's wrong?" "I think," Pastor Morrison said carefully, "that there are some hungers that grow stronger when fed, even when fed with holy things. Especially when fed with holy things." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. "My grandmother's journal," she wrote about it listening to the prayers. About the blood on an altar. Pastor Morrison closed his eyes. The last time I saw Evelyn, she told me she'd found a way to make the prayers more effective. She said she'd discovered what it really wanted, and that she was prepared to give it to her. I tried to stop her, but... He opened his eyes and looked at Sarah with an expression that was almost apologetic. She said it was the only way to protect you. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Protect me from what? From inheriting what she inherited. From becoming the next in line to carry the burden. Pastor Morrison stood and walked to the altar, his movements slow and deliberate. But I'm afraid her sacrifice may have only delayed the inevitable. The presence, whatever it is, it doesn't die when we die. It waits. Sarah stood as well, her legs unsteady. I need to go back to the house. Sarah, no. Let me help you. Let me try to. You said yourself that prayer doesn't work. Sarah was already moving toward the door. If my grandmother spent 40 years praying and it only got stronger, then prayer isn't the answer. She left Pastor Morrison standing at the altar and drove back to the estate through countryside that now seemed to lean inward, as if the very landscape were conspiring to funnel her back to the house that waited with its pulsing door and carved symbols and patient, hungry attention. Back in the library, Sarah knelt before the shelves of defaced books and did something she hadn't done since childhood. She clasped her hands together, closed her eyes, and began to pray. The words came slowly at first, the familiar cadences of the Lord's Prayer that she'd learned at her mother's knee. But as she continued, other words began to intrude, syllables that felt ancient and wrong, sounds that her mouth shaped without her conscious direction. The symbols carved into the books began to glow with a soft, pulsing light that matched the rhythm of the basement door. Sarah's voice grew stronger, but the words emerging from her throat were no longer English, no longer anything she recognized. The language was harsh and beautiful, terrible and seductive, and she understood with growing horror that she had always known these words, that they had been waiting in her bloodline for generations, passed down through genetic memory from mother to daughter like a virus of faith. When she finally stopped speaking, the silence that followed was absolute. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. Sarah opened her eyes and found that the carved symbols were still glowing, and in their light she could see something else, shadowy figures standing between the shelves, watching her with faces that looked like her own but worn by centuries of desperate prayer. The basement door pulsed once, twice, and Sarah realized that her prayer had been an invitation. The shadowy figures faded with the morning light, but their presence lingered in Sarah's peripheral vision like afterimages burned into her retinas. She had spent the night curled in her grandmother's reading chair, afraid to sleep, afraid to close her eyes and see those familiar faces again, faces that wore her features but carried the weight of decades, centuries even, of accumulated terror. Sarah knew she needed to find more journals. If her grandmother had kept one record of her experiences, there had to be others, older accounts that might explain what she had stumbled into. The house seemed to sense her purpose. Doors that had been locked the day before now opened at her touch, revealing rooms she was certain hadn't existed during her childhood visits. Behind the kitchen, she found a pantry that extended far deeper than the house's exterior walls should have allowed. The shelves were lined with preserving jars filled with substances she didn't want to identify, and at the very back, hidden behind sacks of flour that had hardened to stone, she discovered a wooden chest secured with a padlock that looked older than the house itself. The key was exactly where she expected to find it, hanging from a nail driven into the underside of the pantry's highest shelf, as if her grandmother had wanted it found but only by someone tall enough, desperate enough, to look in the right place. Sarah's fingers trembled as she inserted the key and turned it. The lock opened with a click that seemed to echo through dimensions she couldn't see. Inside the chest were more journals, dozens of them, each bearing a different woman's name on the cover. Sarah lifted them out with hands that felt disconnected from her body, arranging them on the kitchen table in chronological order based on the dates inscribed on their spines. The earliest was dated 1847 and belonged to Mercy Marrowgate. The most recent, aside from her grandmother's, bore the name Helen Marrowgate, Sarah's mother. She opened Mercy's journal first, squinting to decipher handwriting that belonged to another century. The early entries were mundane, complaints about harsh winters, notes about preserving food, brief mentions of a husband who was often away on business. But as Sarah read deeper, a pattern emerged that made her stomach clench with recognition. "The dreams have begun again," Mercy had written. "I see her face, my daughter Mary, though she is only 3, and in the dreams she is grown and screaming. Something watches her, something that has been waiting since before her birth. Thomas says I am allowing my feminine nerves to overcome my reason, but he does not see what I see when I look at Mary's eyes. She is already listening to something I cannot hear." Sarah flipped ahead, her breath coming in short gasps. "I have made contact with the presence that haunts our line. It spoke to me in the language of my nightmares, and I understood every word though I had never heard them before. It wants my daughter, but it is willing to negotiate. Prayers, it said. Give it prayers, and it will content itself with watching rather than taking. I have agreed. God forgive me, but I have agreed." The entries that followed detailed Mercy's descent into obsessive devotion. Hours spent in prayer, knees bleeding from kneeling on rough wooden floors, lips cracked from reciting scripture until her voice gave out. But the prayers weren't ordinary, they were infused with the same strange language Sarah had found herself speaking in the library, words that seemed to bridge the gap between supplication and summoning. "Mary is safe," the final entry read. "The presence has accepted my offering of faith. It feeds on my prayers now instead of hungering for her flesh. But I fear what will happen when Mary has a daughter of her own. Will the prayers I have given be enough, or will the price grow higher?" Sarah's hands shook as she reached for the next journal, Mary's, dated 1873. The handwriting was different but the story was horrifyingly familiar. Mary had inherited not just her mother's burden but an amplified version of it. The presence had grown stronger, more demanding. Prayers alone were no longer sufficient. "I found Mother's hidden room today," Mary had written. "The altar she built in the basement, behind the door she never let me approach. The wood is stained black with her blood. She never told me that prayers alone would not be enough, that I would need to offer more than words to keep my daughter safe. But Catherine is only 2, and already it watches her with hunger that makes my bones ache." Sarah turned pages with mounting horror, reading about Mary's progression from prayer to self-harm, from devotion to sacrifice. The presence had demanded blood mixed with holy words, wounds opened while reciting those ancient syllables that seemed to bypass human language entirely. Each cut, each drop of blood, bought Catherine a few more years of protection. But the protection was temporary. Catherine's journal, begun in 1901, revealed that each generation's sacrifice only fed the entity's appetite for more. Catherine had offered years of her life, aging rapidly as she channeled her vitality into maintaining the barrier between the presence and her daughter Margaret. "I am 35 but look 60, Catherine wrote. Each prayer costs me months. Each ritual demands more of my life force. But Margaret remains untouched, and I tell myself this is enough. I tell myself that when she comes of age, perhaps the presence will have grown satisfied with what our family has given it. I tell myself many lies in the dark hours before dawn." Sarah reached for Margaret's journal with hands that had gone numb. The dates spanned from 1923 to 1955, and the handwriting was more frantic than any that had come before. Margaret's entries revealed the terrible escalation that each generation had hidden from the next. "It is not satisfied," Margaret wrote. "It will never be satisfied. Each offering only teaches it to hunger for more. Mother's life force sustained it for decades, but now it wants something new, something it has never tasted. It wants innocence actively corrupted rather than passively consumed. It wants me to bring my daughter to the altar willingly, to make her complicit in her own offering. The pages that follow detailed Margaret's refusal and the price she paid for it. The presence had turned its attention to her directly, no longer content to wait for her daughter to mature. Margaret had been forced to make increasingly desperate bargains, offering not just her own life but her sanity, her memories, pieces of her soul itself to keep her daughter Helen safe. "I will not bring Helen to the altar," Margaret's final entry read. "I will not make her watch as I carve the symbols into my flesh. I will not teach her the words that bridge prayer and summoning. Let the presence take me entirely rather than touch her with its corruption. Perhaps if I give it everything I am, it will forget about our bloodline entirely." But Margaret's sacrifice had only delayed the inevitable. Sarah opened her mother's journal, Helen's journal, with tears streaming down her face. The dates began in 1978 and ended abruptly in 1983, the year Sarah was born. Helen's entries revealed the truth that all the previous generations had tried to hide from their daughters. The presence didn't just want offerings from the Marrowgate women. It wanted to breed with them, to create children who carried its essence in their blood. Each generation's sacrifices had been attempts to satisfy its hunger without submitting to its ultimate demand. "I am pregnant," Helen had written. "I thought I was careful, thought I understood what was happening to our family. But the presence found a way. It whispered to me in dreams, showed me visions of a child who would carry its power and my humanity. I thought I was making love to David, but when I opened my eyes, there was something else in the bed with me, something that wore my husband's face but moved with inhuman patience." The entries that followed chronicled Helen's growing understanding of what was growing inside her. The child would be born with the presence's attention already focused on it, already listening for the ancient words, already hungry for the offerings that previous generations had learned to provide. "I know what I must do," Helen's final entry read. "The presence has grown too strong, too demanding. Each generation's sacrifices have only fed its power and its appetite. I cannot let it have Sarah, but I also cannot let our line continue. The child will be born, but I will die in the birthing, and perhaps my death will be offering enough to satisfy it for another generation. Perhaps Sarah will be the last, and the curse will die with me." But Helen had miscalculated. Sarah set down the journal and walked to the basement door, which pulsed with increasing intensity as she approached. She understood now why she was the only Marrowgate daughter born in 30 years, why her mother had died screaming prayers in that ancient language, why her grandmother had spent 40 years desperately trying to reinforce barriers that had been crumbling for generations. The presence hadn't been satisfied with Helen's death. It had been waiting for Sarah to mature, to return to the house, to discover the truth about her bloodline and take her place in the cycle. But Sarah also understood something her ancestors hadn't: each generation's escalating sacrifices hadn't been protecting their daughters. They had been feeding the presence, teaching it to want more, helping it grow stronger with each passing decade. The basement door pulsed once, twice, and Sarah heard her name whispered in voices that sounded like every Marrowgate woman who had ever lived. But now she could hear something else in those voices, not just desperation and fear, but hunger. The presence had been learning from their sacrifices, growing not just in power but in understanding of human nature, human weakness, human love. It knew exactly what it would take to make Sarah willingly walk through that door. The hollow Bible sat on the library shelf like a secret waiting to be discovered. Sarah might have missed it entirely if not for the way it seemed to lean forward slightly, as if the weight inside had shifted its center of gravity. When she pulled it from among the other defaced volumes, it rattled softly, and she realized that the entire center had been carved out, leaving only the cover and a few intact pages at the beginning and end. Inside the hollow space, wrapped in cloth that might once have been white but had yellowed with age and something else, was an iron key unlike any she had seen in the house. It was old, older than the house itself, she suspected, and covered with symbols that matched those carved into the religious texts. The metal was warm to the touch, as if it had been held in someone's palm just moments before she found it. Sarah knew without being told that this was the key to the basement door. The knowledge came from somewhere deeper than logic, from the same place that had supplied the ancient words during her prayer. Her bloodline carried more than just the presence's attention, it carried instructions, genetic memories passed down like recipes for disaster. She descended the main staircase with the key clutched in her fist, its warmth spreading up her arm like an infection. The basement door stood at the end of a hallway she was certain hadn't existed the day before, its white paint now clearly visible as a thin veneer over something much older and darker. The pulsing had intensified, and with each beat Sarah could hear something like whispered conversation, as if a crowd of people were gathered on the other side, waiting for her arrival. The key slid into a lock that materialized as she approached, the metal flowing like liquid around the key's strange shape. Sarah turned it and heard mechanisms engaging that sounded less like a lock opening and more like something breathing in anticipation. The door swung inward on hinges that made no sound at all, revealing stone steps that descended into darkness that seemed to move with its own current. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying scents that made Sarah's stomach turn. Incense and candle wax, yes, but underneath those familiar church smells were others, copper and salt, decay and something sweet that reminded her of flowers left too long in a vase. She fumbled for a light switch and found one, though she was certain no electrical work had ever been done in this part of the house. The bulbs that illuminated as she descended were old-fashioned things with exposed filaments, casting a yellow light that seemed to bend and curve around objects that weren't there. The stone steps were worn smooth in the center from generations of feet, and as Sarah descended, she began to see why. The basement had been transformed into a chapel, but not one that any conventional faith would recognize. Rough wooden pews faced an altar carved from a single block of stone that looked far older than anything else in the house. The walls were covered in writing, layer upon layer of carved text that began near the ceiling with neat, careful prayers and devolved as they descended into increasingly frantic scrawl. Sarah moved closer to the walls and realized she was looking at the physical record of her family's desperation. Near the ceiling, carved in letters that might have been done with a chisel and careful planning, were conventional prayers, the Lord's Prayer, Hail Marys, psalms she recognized from childhood Sunday services. But as her eyes moved downward, the text became less recognizable, mixing English with that ancient language she had found herself speaking. Lower still, the words became symbols, then scratches that looked like they had been carved with fingernails rather than tools. The stone near the floor was stained dark and worn smooth, as if countless hands had pressed against it while making offerings too desperate for language. Sarah approached the altar with steps that felt like walking through water. The stone block was massive, easily 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, carved with channels that led to a depression in the center. The entire surface was stained black, but not with age, with blood that had been offered so frequently over so many years that it had become part of the stone itself. Around the altar's base, she could see offerings that had been left by previous generations. Candles burned down to puddles of wax, photographs of children and grandchildren, jewelry that might have been wedding rings or baptismal gifts, and things she tried not to look at too closely, things that looked organic, personal, that spoke of sacrifices made from living flesh. When Sarah placed her palms on the altar's surface, the world exploded into vision. She was Mercy, kneeling on rough wooden floors while something invisible circled her like a predator. The presence was smaller then, newer, fed only by the ambient faith of a young country still finding its religious footing. It spoke to her in whispers, promising protection for her daughter in exchange for prayers, for attention, for the acknowledgement that it existed and was worthy of worship. She was Mary, opening veins with a kitchen knife while reciting prayers that made her tongue bleed. The presence had grown since her mother's time, become more demanding, more specific in its requirements. Blood mixed with faith was more nourishing than either alone, and Mary learned to offer both with increasing frequency as the thing's appetite expanded. She was Catherine, feeling her life drain away with each ritual, each offering of her vitality to keep the present satisfied. It had grown again, become something that could drain years from a willing sacrifice, but Catherine told herself the trade was worth it. Her daughter would be safe, even if Catherine herself aged a decade for every year that passed. She was Margaret, discovering that the presence was no longer content with passive offerings. It wanted corruption now, wanted to turn love into a weapon against itself. It whispered instructions for rituals that would taint her daughter's innocence, make her complicit in her own spiritual destruction. Margaret had refused, and the presence had turned its hunger directly on her, consuming not just her life but her sanity, her memories, her very sense of self. She was Helen, understanding finally what the presence truly wanted, not offerings from the Marrowgate women, but the women themselves. It wanted to breed with their bloodline, to create children who carried its essence and could serve as anchors for its growing power. Helen had tried to break the cycle through death, but death was just another offering, another form of nourishment for something that had learned to feed on sacrifice itself. And finally, she was herself, Sarah, standing in a basement chapel that had been built one prayer at a time, one desperate offering after another, by women who thought they were protecting their daughters but had instead been feeding something that grew stronger with every act of love-motivated desperation. The visions faded, leaving Sarah gasping and shaking beside the altar. But she was no longer alone in the chapel. The presence had finally revealed itself, not as the demon or evil spirit she had expected, but as something far worse. It stood behind the altar like a priest addressing a congregation, but its form shifted and flowed like smoke given weight. Sometimes it looked human, tall, robed, with features that might have been handsome if they weren't so perfectly symmetrical as to be inhuman. Other times it appeared as pure shadow, a void in the shape of a tension that bent light around itself. But always, regardless of its form, it radiated the unmistakable aura of something that had been worshipped. "You understand now," it said, and its voice was every prayer Sarah had ever heard, every hymn that had ever been sung, every word of faith that had ever been spoken. "Your family has been feeding me for generations, teaching me to hunger, helping me grow strong on the very faith they offer to protect their children." Sarah backed away from the altar, but there was nowhere to go. The chapel had no exit save the stairs she had descended, and the presence stood between her and escape. "You're not a demon," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "You're something that feeds on faith itself." Faith, the presence agreed, its form shifting to something that looked almost like her grandmother, her mother, herself. Desperation. Love perverted into sacrifice. "Your ancestors created me through their very attempts to banish me. Each prayer made me stronger, each offering taught me new hungers, each generation's sacrifice showed me new ways to feed." Sarah thought of the carved walls, the blood-stained altar, the journals filled with increasingly desperate attempts to protect daughters who would grow up to make even more desperate sacrifices for their own children. "The cycle," she said. "We created you. You shaped me," the presence corrected. "Gave me form through your attention, substance through your offerings, purpose through your fear. I am what faith becomes when it is offered not in joy but in terror, not in hope but in desperation. I am the God your family created through generations of love twisted into sacrifice." The presence moved closer, and Sarah could smell incense and blood, could hear the whispered prayers of every Marrowgate woman who had knelt in this chapel. "And now it is your turn to choose," it continued. "Continue the cycle your ancestors began, feed me with your desperation and your offerings, and I will be content to wait for the next generation. Or..." It smiled with too many teeth, with features that shifted between human and void. "Offer me something new. Offer me yourself, willingly, completely, and perhaps the hunger will finally be satisfied." Sarah pressed her back against the carved wall, feeling the desperate prayers of generations cutting into her skin through her clothes. The presence's offer hung in the air like incense, sweet and poisonous and terrifying in its simplicity. If you discovered your family had been feeding something evil for generations to protect you, would you continue the cycle or break it? What would you sacrifice for the people you love? Sarah's answer came not in words but in action. She grabbed one of the ancient candles from the altar's base and hurled it against the carved wall, where decades of wax had built up like spiritual scar tissue. The flame caught immediately, spreading along the accumulated offerings with a hunger that rivaled the presence itself. "You think fire will cleanse this place?" The entity's voice carried amusement that felt like ice water in Sarah's veins. "Your great-great-grandmother tried that in 1863. The chapel burned, but faith leaves marks deeper than flame can reach." But Sarah wasn't listening. She was grabbing everything combustible she could find: prayer books left as offerings, wooden crosses carved by desperate hands, bundles of dried herbs that had been used in rituals she didn't want to understand. The basement filled with smoke that smelled like burning devotion, acrid and sweet and wrong. The presence's amusement faded as the flames spread up the carved walls, consuming generations of desperate prayers. Its form began to flicker, becoming less substantial as the physical record of the Marrowgate family's faith transformed into ash and smoke. "You don't understand what you're doing," it said, and for the first time its voice carried something like concern. "These offerings, these prayers, they are not chains that bind me. They are the very substance of my existence. Destroy them, and you don't banish me. You set me free." Sarah paused, a bundle of photographs in her hands, pictures of Marrowgate children spanning decades, all left as offerings to keep them safe. The entity's words penetrated through her panic, and she began to understand the terrible logic of what her family had done. The prayers, the rituals, the sacrifices, they hadn't been feeding the entity so much as containing it. Each offering had been like a meal thrown to a caged animal, keeping it satisfied enough to remain in its designated place. But now, with the chapel burning and the physical anchors of its presence being destroyed, the entity was no longer bound to the basement. The prayers were a prison, Sarah whispered, dropping the photographs as understanding dawned. "You weren't growing stronger from them. You were being held in place by them. Your grandmother understood this near the end," the presence said, its form becoming more solid as the flames consumed the last of the wall carvings. "Why do you think she continued the rituals even when her faith had died? Why do you think she never missed a single night of prayer, even when the words tasted like poison in her mouth?" The temperature in the basement plummeted as the entity's restraints burned away. Sarah could see her breath now, and frost was forming on the stone surfaces despite the flames. The presence was drawing energy from the environment itself, no longer limited to the spiritual nourishment provided by generations of desperate faith. She died because she stopped, Sarah realized. When she got too weak to continue the rituals. "I claimed what was owed," the entity finished. 40 years of containment through her offerings, and when the offerings stopped, the debt came due. But death is such a limited payment, don't you think? Temporary. Finite. Nothing like the renewable resource of a living family line. Sarah ran for the stairs, but the stone steps began to crack and crumble under her feet as the presence's liberation sent shockwaves through the house's foundation. She barely made it to the basement door before the ceiling of the chapel collapsed, sending up a cloud of dust and ash that carried the screams of every prayer that had ever been carved into those walls. The house above was no longer the static monument to family history she had explored over the past 2 days. Now it was alive with malevolent energy that had been compressed into the basement for generations and was finally free to expand. Doors slammed open and shut in rhythms that sounded like applause. Windows cracked in patterns that looked like the symbols from the religious books. The very walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if the house had become a living thing. Sarah stumbled through rooms that rearranged themselves as she moved, hallways that led to different destinations than they had moments before. The presence was no longer bound to human form or even to a single location, it was diffusing through the entire structure, claiming the house as its new body. In what had been the living room, Sarah found portraits of Marrowgate women weeping blood that ran down the walls in streams. In the kitchen, every surface was covered with frost except for the stove, which burned with flames that gave no heat. The library had become a tornado of pages torn from books, swirling in patterns that spelled out words in that ancient language, creating prayers that hung in the air like accusations. Sarah fought her way up the main staircase, which had become a moving thing that tried to carry her back down with each step she climbed. The presence's voice followed her, no longer coming from a single source but from the house itself, the walls, the floors, the very air she breathed. "You cannot escape what you have freed," it whispered from the banister under her hand. "You cannot outrun what you have become responsible for unleashing." She reached the second floor and ran for her grandmother's bedroom, the only space in the house that still felt remotely stable. But even there, changes were evident. The mirror on the vanity showed not Sarah's reflection but the faces of all the Marrowgate women who had come before, each one speaking words of condemnation for what she had done. Sarah grabbed her mother's journal from where she had left it and flipped through it with desperate fingers, looking for something, anything, that might explain how to reverse what she had unleashed. The presence's liberation was accelerating, and she could feel the house beginning to tear itself apart as it struggled to contain energies that had never been meant for physical existence. Near the back of the journal, she found pages she was certain she hadn't seen before, written in handwriting that was her mother's but shaky, desperate, clearly written under extreme duress. The dates placed them just days before Sarah's birth. "The contractions have begun," her mother had written. "But something is wrong. The child is not moving as it should, and I can feel the presence watching, waiting. It knows this birth will be different from the others. This child will carry its mark from the moment of first breath." Sarah's hands shook as she read further. Her mother had documented a labor that lasted 3 days, during which the presence had grown increasingly agitated, increasingly demanding. It had wanted something from Helen, some final offering that would seal its connection to the child about to be born. "I can feel myself dying," Helen had written in handwriting that was barely legible. "The child is taking everything I have, and something else is taking what's left. But I have made a bargain. The presence will let me live long enough to deliver safely, and in return." The ink here was smeared, as if Helen's tears had fallen on the page. "In return, I have promised it the child's firstborn. A daughter if God grants it, offered willingly when she comes of age. The cycle will continue, but my daughter will live to see it." The journal fell from Sarah's numb hands. Her mother hadn't died from childbirth complications. She had died from the spiritual exertion of making a pact that bound not just herself but her unborn daughter to the entity's service. Helen had traded her life and Sarah's future fertility to ensure that Sarah would be born safely, never considering that she was simply postponing the payment rather than avoiding it. The presence's laughter filled the bedroom, and Sarah looked up to see it manifesting in the space above her grandmother's bed. It was larger now, more substantial, its form shifting between the human shape it had worn in the basement and something vast and tentacled that pressed against the room's boundaries. "You understand now why I was content to wait," it said. "Your mother's bargain was more generous than any your family had made before. Not just your life, but the life of your child, offered before that child was even conceived. I have been patient for 30 years, watching you grow, waiting for you to mature enough to fulfill the contract." Sarah pressed herself against the bedroom wall, feeling the carved prayers from the basement echo through the house's structure. The entity was right, she had freed it from its containment, but she had also accelerated a timeline that might have allowed her years more of normal life. But now, the presence continued, its form solidifying as it fed on her terror. "Thanks to your destruction of my anchors, I no longer need to wait for biological processes. I can take what was promised immediately, along with everything else your family owes me." The bedroom walls began to crack, and through the fissures Sarah could see not the outdoors but the basement chapel, somehow existing in the same space despite being physically destroyed. The presence was rewriting reality around the house, turning it into a place where all the generations of desperate faith could exist simultaneously. Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that her attempt to break the cycle had instead completed it. She had freed the entity from the limitations of the basement, given it access to the entire house and everyone who had ever lived in it, and accelerated her mother's pact to immediate collection. The presence smiled with features that looked like Sarah's own, and she understood that there would be no escape, no last-minute salvation, no way to undo what generations of love and desperation had created. The entity had been patient for over a century, but its patience had finally come to an end. The walls of the bedroom dissolved like watercolors in rain, and Sarah found herself standing in a space that existed between realities, part her grandmother's room, part the destroyed basement chapel, part something else entirely that her mind couldn't process without fragmenting. The presence had grown enormous now, no longer constrained by physical form or the need to appear remotely human. It filled the impossible space like a living storm, its attention focused on Sarah with the intensity of a magnifying glass concentrating sunlight. But it wasn't looking at her face. Its gaze was fixed on her abdomen with an hunger that made her skin crawl. "I can hear it," the entity whispered, its voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere. "The heartbeat that isn't yours. The blood that carries my essence along with your mother's desperate bargain. Did you think I would wait for you to discover it naturally?" Sarah's hand moved to her stomach without conscious direction, and as her palm pressed against the fabric of her shirt, she felt it, a flutter of movement that was too purposeful to be anything but life. The nausea she had attributed to stress, the exhaustion she had blamed on the house's oppressive atmosphere, the strange sensitivity to smells and sounds, it all crystallized into a truth that made her legs give out. She was pregnant. Had been pregnant, she realized, since before she arrived at the house. The timing was perfect, orchestrated by forces that had been planning this moment for longer than her lifetime. 3 weeks, the presence confirmed, its form shifting to show her visions of cellular division, of something growing inside her that carried both human DNA and something else, something that had been woven into the Marrowgate bloodline through generations of exposure to the entity's influence. "Conceived the night you first dreamed of this house, when I reached across the distance between us and whispered in your sleep. Your grandmother was dying, and I needed to ensure the continuity of my line." Sarah crawled backward across what might have been floor or might have been the altar stone from the basement, her movements desperate and uncoordinated. "You're lying. That's impossible. I would know. Would you?" The entity's amusement was like acid in the air. When have the Marrowgate women ever truly known what was happening to their bodies, their minds, their souls? Your great-great-grandmother thought her nightmares were just dreams. Your grandmother thought her rituals were protecting you. Your mother thought her bargain would save your life. Each generation has been blind to the truth until it was too late to change course. The space around them began to populate with figures, translucent at first, then growing more solid as the entity drew power from Sarah's despair. She recognized them from the portraits and the journal entries: Mercy, Mary, Catherine, Margaret, Helen. All the Marrowgate women who had come before, but not as they had appeared in life. These versions carried the weight of their choices, their faces marked by the knowledge of what their love and desperation had ultimately created. "Tell her," the entity commanded, and the ghostly figures began to speak in unison, their voices creating a chorus of confession that filled the impossible space. "I thought I was protecting my daughter," Mercy said, her form flickering between the young mother she had been and the worn woman she had died as. "But every prayer I offered taught it to hunger for more. Every night I spent on my knees gave it strength to reach further into our bloodline. I cut myself because it demanded blood," Mary continued, holding up arms that bore scars from wrist to elbow. "But the blood didn't satisfy it, it taught it that we would harm ourselves for love, that our bodies were currencies we would spend to protect our children." Catherine stepped forward, her form aged beyond her years by the entity's feeding. "I gave it my life force, decades of my existence, and told myself the trade was worth it. But I was only showing it that time itself could be harvested, that human lifespan was another resource to be consumed. Margaret's ghost was the most damaged, her face shifting between sanity and madness as she spoke. I refused to corrupt my daughter directly, so it took my mind instead, piece by piece, until I couldn't remember why I was fighting or what I was trying to protect. My resistance became just another form of offering. Finally, Helen stepped forward, and Sarah could see that her mother's spirit was different from the others. Where they bore the marks of their choices, Helen appeared as she had in the hospital the day Sarah was born, exhausted but triumphant, holding a baby she thought she had saved. "I made the final bargain," Helen said, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that had defined Sarah's entire existence. "I promised it your firstborn in exchange for your safe delivery. I thought I was breaking the cycle by ensuring you would live, never realizing that I was simply postponing the payment and adding interest." Sarah struggled to her feet, her hand still pressed to her stomach. "But why? Why does it want children? What does it gain from?" Continuation, the entity interrupted, its form now towering above the assembled ghosts of Sarah's ancestors. "I am what your family's faith has created, but faith alone is finite. It dies with the believer, fades with time, can be abandoned or forgotten. But bloodlines, those are renewable. Each generation can be shaped to provide exactly what I need, when I need it." The entity gestured, and Sarah could see her family tree spreading out around them like a vast web, with herself at the center and branches extending into futures she didn't want to contemplate. Each potential child, grandchild, great-grandchild was marked with symbols that indicated their planned role in feeding the entity's growth. "Your child will be born carrying my essence," the presence continued. "Not human, not other, but something in between. It will serve as an anchor for my power in your world, and when it comes of age, it will breed with humans to create more anchors, more connections, more sources of the desperate faith that nourishes me." Sarah saw it then, the true scope of what the entity had been working toward through generations of patient manipulation. Not just the periodic offerings of desperate prayers and blood, but the creation of an entire hybrid bloodline that would serve as a permanent bridge between its realm and human reality. The Marrowgate women were never the victims, she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "We were the breeding stock. You were willing participants," the entity corrected. "Every prayer offered in desperation, every sacrifice made for love, every bargain struck to protect a child, all of it freely given, all of it consent to my shaping of your bloodline. I have never taken anything that wasn't offered." The ghosts of her ancestors nodded in agreement, their faces carrying expressions of terrible understanding. They had all made their choices willingly, motivated by love and desperation, never realizing that their very willingness to sacrifice everything for their children was exactly what the entity had been cultivating across generations. Sarah felt the child in her womb flutter again, and this time the movement was accompanied by something else, a whisper in that ancient language, words that her unborn child was already learning to speak. The entity's influence wasn't waiting for birth, it was shaping the child from the moment of conception, ensuring that it would be born already knowing its purpose, already hungry for the faith and desperation that would feed its supernatural parent. "No," Sarah said, the word coming out as barely more than breath. "I won't let this continue. I won't let you use my child the way you used all of us." The entity's laughter was like the sound of every prayer that had ever been offered in desperation, beautiful and terrible and utterly without mercy. "And what will you do to stop me? Destroy another chapel? Burn more books? You have already seen what happens when you try to break the bonds that contain me. I simply grow stronger and more free." Sarah looked at the ghosts of her ancestors, at the family tree spreading out around her like a map of predetermined suffering, at her own hands pressed protectively over a child that was already lost to forces she couldn't combat. The entity was right, every action the Marrowgate women had taken to protect their children had only made the situation worse, had only fed the presence and helped it grow more powerful. But as she stood there, surrounded by the weight of generational failure, Sarah began to understand something that her ancestors had missed. They had all tried to save their children while preserving their own lives, their own sanity, their own souls. They had all looked for solutions that would allow them to continue existing while breaking the cycle. They had never considered that the only way to truly end the entity's influence might be to ensure that there was no next generation for it to claim. Sarah's hand moved to her stomach again, but this time the gesture carried a different kind of protection, not the desperate hope of previous generations, but the cold calculation of someone who had finally understood the true nature of the game being played. The entity's attention sharpened as it sensed the change in her emotional state. "What are you thinking, Sarah? What new bargain do you believe you can strike?" But Sarah wasn't thinking about bargains anymore. She was thinking about endings. Sarah's decision crystallized like ice forming on water, sudden, complete, and irreversible. She looked at the ghostly figures of her ancestors, at the entity that towered above them feeding on generations of desperate love, and finally understood what none of them had been willing to consider. The cycle couldn't be broken by finding a better bargain or a more powerful prayer. It could only be ended by ensuring there was nothing left for the entity to feed on. "You're right," she said, her voice steady for the first time since entering the house. "Every Marrowgate woman has made the same mistake. We've all tried to save our children while preserving ourselves, never realizing that our very survival is what keeps the cycle going." The entity's form shifted, sensing something in Sarah's tone that it hadn't encountered before. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that my ancestors were thinking too small." Sarah moved through the impossible space toward what had been her grandmother's vanity table, which now existed simultaneously in the bedroom and the destroyed chapel. The mirror showed not her reflection but the truth of her situation, a woman carrying a child that would never be fully human, standing in a house that had become a feeding ground for something that had learned to consume love itself. On the vanity, among her grandmother's possessions, Sarah found what she was looking for, a small bottle of lamp oil that had been used to fuel the reading lights by the bed. She uncapped it and began pouring the oil over the wooden surfaces, over the photographs of Marrowgate children, over the journals that contained generations of desperate bargains. "Fire didn't work before because you weren't really contained by the physical chapel," she continued, moving methodically through the space. "You were contained by the faith itself, by the ongoing belief that the bargains were necessary, that the sacrifices were worthwhile. But I don't believe anymore." The entity's attention focused on her with new intensity. "You cannot destroy me through disbelief alone. I exist beyond your faith now, anchored by the child you carry, by the contracts already made." "The child I carry," Sarah interrupted, and her hand moved to her stomach one final time. The flutter of movement beneath her palm felt different now, not like life developing, but like something alien using her body as an incubation chamber. "The child that was conceived through supernatural manipulation, that carries your essence, that will never be fully human. That child." Understanding dawned in the entity's shifting features. "You wouldn't. The maternal instinct, the love that has driven every Marrowgate woman, is exactly what you've been feeding on." Sarah struck a match from a book she found in her grandmother's drawer, the same kind of matches that had lit decades of desperate prayers. "You created this pregnancy to ensure your continuation, but you made one mistake. You assumed I would love something that was designed to destroy humanity." The flame caught the oil and began to spread, but this fire was different from the one in the basement. This wasn't an attempt to destroy the entity's anchors, this was an attempt to destroy the entity's future. The flame spread across surfaces that shouldn't burn, consuming not just physical objects but the very concept of continuation that the entity required. The ghosts of Sarah's ancestors began to fade as the fire spread, their forms losing coherence as the faith that had created them dissolved. But instead of fear or sadness, their faces showed something Sarah had never seen in any of the journal entries or portraits: relief. "We're sorry," Helen's fading form whispered. "We thought we were protecting you, but we were just feeding it, making it stronger. End this, Sarah. End what we were too weak to finish." The entity's form began to contract as the flames consumed more of the space, its vast presence being drawn back into something smaller, more desperate. You don't understand what you're doing. The child, your child, is yours, not mine, Sarah said, and she could feel the truth of it in her bones. The pregnancy had never been natural, never been the result of human love or even human choice. It had been a deliberate implantation, a supernatural violation designed to ensure the entity's survival beyond the death of its current host bloodline. Sarah pulled out another match and lit it, then dropped it onto the oil-soaked journals. The flames that erupted were white-hot, consuming not just paper and ink but the very concepts written on the pages, the bargains, the prayers, the desperate attempts to negotiate with something that had never intended to honor its agreements. Every prayer my family offered taught you what we valued most, she said, backing toward the window as the fire spread. Every sacrifice showed you what we were willing to lose. Every bargain revealed what we would do to protect what we loved. But you made one error in your calculations. The entity was shrinking now, its form becoming more human-like as its power base burned away. It looked like Sarah herself, but wearing an expression of growing panic. What error? Sarah smiled, and for the first time since entering the house, the expression felt genuine. You assumed that discovering the truth would make me more desperate to save the child, more willing to make an even greater bargain. You never considered that learning the truth might make me willing to end everything instead. She could feel the pregnancy terminating as the flames consumed the supernatural forces that had created it. The entity's essence, woven into the developing child's cells, was being burned away along with everything else. The loss should have been devastating, should have triggered every maternal instinct that had driven her ancestors to their desperate bargains. Instead, Sarah felt only a profound sense of liberation. The entity made one final attempt to preserve itself, reaching toward Sarah with hands that looked like her own. Wait. We can negotiate. I can offer you nothing, Sarah finished. You can offer me nothing, because I'm not trying to save anything anymore. I'm just ending it. She broke the window with her grandmother's reading lamp and used the curtains to climb down to the first-floor roof, then dropped to the ground as the entire house began to burn. The flames were spreading impossibly fast, consuming not just the physical structure but something deeper, the accumulated weight of generations of desperate faith, the spiritual architecture that had allowed the entity to exist in human reality. From the lawn, Sarah watched her grandmother's house burn with flames that changed color as they consumed different aspects of the entity's presence. White fire ate the journals and photographs. Blue flames consumed the carved prayers. Red fire devoured the blood-stained altar that existed in the basement that no longer existed. And finally, golden fire, the color of sunrise, of hope, of things beginning rather than ending, consumed the entity itself. The presence made no sound as it died. It simply faded, like a radio being tuned away from a station, until there was nothing left but the ordinary crackling of wood and cloth being consumed by ordinary fire. Sarah sat on the grass and watched the house burn until dawn. When the fire department arrived, they found only the smoldering remains of a century-old structure that had been destroyed by what appeared to be an electrical fire. Sarah told them she had escaped through a window when the wiring in the walls began to spark. She didn't mention the pregnancy that had never been, the entity that had fed on generations of faith, or the cycle that had finally been broken not through love or sacrifice, but through the willingness to let everything end rather than let it continue. Pastor Morrison found her 3 days later at a motel in the next town, packing her car for the drive back to Boston. He looked older than he had when she'd visited his church, as if something that had been supporting him had suddenly been removed. The house is gone, he said, sitting heavily in the chair by the motel room's small table. But more than that. I can feel it, the weight that's been pressing on this town for over a century. It's gone too. Sarah nodded, folding clothes into her suitcase with mechanical precision. It won't be coming back. The Marrowgate line. Ends with me. Sarah closed the suitcase and looked at Pastor Morrison directly. There won't be any more daughters, any more desperate prayers, any more bargains made in basement chapels. Whatever was feeding on my family's faith has starved to death. Pastor Morrison was quiet for a long moment. And you? Are you at peace with what you've done? Sarah considered the question as she loaded her car. She thought about the child that had never really been her child, about the generations of women who had sacrificed everything to protect daughters who would grow up to repeat the same cycle, about the entity that had grown fat on love perverted into desperation. I'm at peace with what I've ended, she said finally. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is ensure that the suffering stops with you. She drove away from Vermont as the sun reached its zenith, leaving behind only ashes and the kind of silence that comes when something that has been screaming for over a century finally stops making noise. In her rearview mirror, she could see smoke still rising from where her grandmother's house had stood, but it was ordinary smoke now, gray and dissipating, carrying no weight of prayer or desperation or supernatural hunger. For the first time in generations, a Marrowgate woman's prayers had been answered not through bargaining or sacrifice, but through the simple act of choosing to let the story end. If you stayed with this story to the end and felt the weight of inherited burdens, comment, some prayers should never be answered.